we'll be talking about something called dissolving stuckness, or advantages and disadvantages. There are a few sheets. If you notice, as we've been working through the course, we've worked on several sheets that we've called worksheets, although they're not really work. They're more like exploration sheets or discovery sheets. That'd probably be a better name for them. As you've been working on them, we've done likes and dislikes, and we've done something on have-tos, also goals. We've worked on goals. There are several sheets that you'll find even after this class that will be very helpful. The goal sheet, the likes and dislikes sheet, and this sheet that we're working on now, advantages and disadvantages sheet, you'll find is very helpful to use on an ongoing basis. I took the course back in 1976. As of today, it was about 22 years ago. And I still use the advantages and disadvantages sheet on a regular basis. It's probably my favorite sheet. And let me explain why. Advantages and disadvantages is a way to really uncover and let go of any area where you've gotten stuck. Any area where there's a recurring thought pattern, behavior, or situation that with just the right amount of focus releasing, you can shift. And you can use advantages, disadvantages on a host of different things. You can use it on goals. In other words, in addition to working on a goal directly, you can do what advantage is it to me to have this goal and what disadvantage is it to me to have this goal. You can use it on decisions. Supposing you have an opportunity, a new job, someone offered you a job and you're not quite sure whether or not to take it. You can do advantages and disadvantages of taking the job. Supposing you have an opportunity to move to a different city or go on a trip with someone that you don't know that well. There's a whole host of areas where you might have to make a decision. Well, if you release on the advantages and the disadvantages, you'll get a lot clearer. And also, I find that you can even do advantages, disadvantages on things that are positive. In other words, you can do advantages and disadvantages of having abundance. It's not necessarily a goal, although most people would like to have more abundance. When you release even on a positive, it seems to really deepen your releasing work and really clean out that area, even if you're already feeling good about it. And let me tell you an example of how powerful this sheet can be. Many years ago, there was a woman who had a real issue with her weight. She was several hundred pounds overweight. The instructor was working with her in the class. It was a small class, so she had plenty of time to work with her individually. She was asking her, what advantage is it to you to be overweight? All that came up is none. There aren't any advantages to being overweight. And she was having absolutely no problem thinking of all the disadvantages. But the instructor was persistent, and she kept asking her, well, what advantage and what disadvantage? And by the way, when you work on advantages and disadvantages, you'll see, as we demonstrated on the tape a little later in this tape, you do one advantage and you release, and you do one disadvantage and you release. And even if nothing comes up, you release on that. There might be some feeling about the fact you couldn't think of an advantage or a disadvantage. To go back to our story, this woman had been releasing on advantages, disadvantages of being overweight. And by about the 9th time, she was actually getting a little frustrated with the instructor for asking her, why are you asking me what advantage there is to being overweight? How could there possibly be an advantage to being this overweight? And she was getting ready to have a little fight with the instructor. And all of a sudden, when the instructor asked her that time, what advantage is it to me to be overweight? She suddenly flashed on a memory of something that had happened 20 years earlier. 20 years earlier, she had been the perfect ideal weight. In fact, she was an exquisitely beautiful woman. And she was married to a man who wasn't particularly responsible. She was hospitalized for an illness that wasn't particularly major, but it was enough to put her in the hospital for a couple of days. And during that time period, the husband took it upon himself to make an investment that he knew his wife wouldn't approve of, but since she wasn't around, he figured he could do the investment, get it done, and be able to report the wonderful results afterwards. Well, of course, since it was an irresponsible investment, it didn't go that well. Towards the end of her stay in the hospital, he showed up in the hospital all sheepish one day and said, honey, sorry, but I lost our investment money. I lost all the money. And in that instant, she got furious, and she had this just fleeting thought, oh, I know how to get back at him. And she totally forgot about it. But when she left the hospital, she went from the type of woman that everyone's head turned when she walked into the room. Not long afterwards, she was overweight, and she kept getting more and more overweight, and had absolutely no understanding why it was happening, because she had totally forgotten that she had made that decision. Well, 20 years later, she was still very overweight. It was a long time since she'd been in that relationship. But what happened was, when she discovered this and released it, it was a very big hook in her subconscious, to a reason she had been holding on to being overweight. When she released that, as soon as she got out of the hospital, she called a diet doctor. A friend had referred her to a year and a half earlier, and she had never called. And she started taking actions about her weight, and they finally started to work. She had taken action before, but they never worked. Diets didn't work. Nothing worked. A year and a half later, she was a normal weight. And years later, she was still maintaining it. So that's how powerful this sheet can be. So as you're working with the sheet, you might either get big ahas, like the one I just described, or you might get a series of small ones, little things that once you see them clearly will help you really shift your consciousness about that particular topic. The other thing is that each advantage and disadvantage together is a layer of unconsciousness or limitation on that particular topic. So it's like drilling for oil. The deeper you get, the more insights, the more understanding, the more freedom comes on that particular topic. And you may never get to like one specific aha. There might be a series of small ones along the way. But if you do advantages, disadvantages, and you're persistent about it, I'm certain you'll see very powerful and profound changes. I've yet to see it not really have a very positive effect any time I've ever focused on advantages and disadvantages. So obviously you can tell from my intonation in my voice and what I've just said about it, I'm pretty enthusiastic about the sheet. So why don't we do some work on it together? If you're continuing to listen to the tape right now, I'm just going to assume that you've already picked a topic that you'd like to do some further releasing on. If you haven't, pause the tape and pick a topic before you go on. Now, as we've already said, advantages and disadvantages is a powerful way of continuing your releasing work. So let's do some work on it now together. Now, for the purpose of us working together, it's not necessary for you to do any writing. I'll explain after we're done how you can work with this sheet by using pen and paper. So think of the topic that you're going to be releasing on, either your goal or the problem or whatever it is, and I'll start asking you the questions. And remember, releasing can be done with eyes open or eyes closed. All that's required is you focusing within and becoming aware of what you're feeling or what you're wanting in this moment. So think of your topic. And what is the advantage to you in having that be that way? And is that a wanting approval, a wanting control, or a wanting security or survival? And whichever want it is, could you just let it go? And what's the disadvantage to you in that topic? Remember to take the first thought or feeling that comes to mind. And then go a little deeper and see if it's a wanting approval, a wanting control, or a wanting security or survival. And whichever want it is, could you just let it go? And what is the advantage to you in that topic? In that being that way, in having that. And is that wanting approval, wanting control, or wanting security or survival? And whichever want it is, could you just set it free? And what's the disadvantage to you in having it be that way? And And does that stir up a wanting approval, a wanting control, or a wanting security or survival? And whichever want it is, could you just let it go? And what's another advantage? And is that a wanting approval, a wanting control, or a wanting security or survival? And could you let it go? And what's a disadvantage? And which want does that stir up? Approval, control, security, or survival? And whichever want it is, could you just let it go? And what's an advantage to you in that topic, or in that goal, or in being that way? And is that stirring up a wanting approval, control, or security, survival? And whichever want it is, could you allow yourself to just let it go? And what's the disadvantage to you in that goal, or that problem, or that situation? And does that stir up a wanting approval, a wanting control, or a wanting security or survival? And whichever want it is, could you just set it free? And what's an advantage? And is that a wanting approval, a wanting control, or a wanting security or survival? And whichever want it is, could you just let it go? And what's a disadvantage? And which want does that stir up? And whatever you're wanting, could you just let it go? And what's another advantage? Now remember, if you're having a hard time coming up with advantages or disadvantages, allow yourself to release on that and just keep going. The deeper you go with this process, the more you'll get out of it. So is that a wanting approval, a wanting control, or a wanting security or survival? And could you let it go? And what's another disadvantage? And is that wanting approval, wanting control, or wanting security or survival? And whichever want it is, could you allow it to be released? And let's do one more of each. So what's another advantage to you in that situation or that goal, or whatever it is that your topic is? And is that a wanting approval, control, security? And whichever want it is, could you just let it go? And what's a disadvantage to you in that goal, or in that situation, or that problem? And is it a wanting approval, control, security? And whichever want it is, could you let it go? Now notice how you already feel differently about what you've been releasing on. This is a very powerful process. The more you work on it, the more you'll get out of it. Now you can either rewind the tape and listen to this some more if you want to go deeper, or you can do some releasing on it on your own by using one of the advantage and disadvantage sheets in your book. And how you work on them is just very similar to what we've been doing together. You ask yourself, what is the advantage to me? You write down the first thought or feeling that comes to mind without any censoring. You see whether it's a wanting approval, control, or security, and you let it go. And you put the appropriate checks in the boxes or in the columns. And then you do a disadvantage. And you ask yourself the same thing. What's the disadvantage to me in whatever it is? You write down the first thought or feeling that comes to mind. You see which want it is, and you let it go, and you make the appropriate check marks. It's important not to make lists. Do one advantage and one disadvantage, and go back and forth. Each advantage and disadvantage together make up a whole layer of limitation on that particular topic. And this is kind of like drilling for oil. If you keep drilling in the same spot, you're sure to hit a geyser of tremendous freedom. So have fun with this chart, and have fun with your releasing.